between places. Beaten and branded, this vagrant is more dangerous than he seems. Abomination. Chapter 1. A Night on the Moor. He cursed himself as the blood leaked from his mangled shoulder. The rumor-haunted moor had promised a trove of rare nocturnal flora and fungi. But he'd been a fool to venture so far without a guide. The beast had pounced without warning and left him in a bad way. Gripping his wound and gritting his teeth, he stumbled toward home under the moon's wide, pitiless eye. Chapter 2. The Antidote Elusive. This infection wore no fever. Instead, his veins ran cold as the moor. An imperfect remedy, delivered imperfectly. He collapsed in agony on the stone floor of his laboratory, racked with violent spasms. Chapter 3. The Tower. The weight of iron shackles roused him from his catatonia. The Inquisitors declared he'd been found covered in blood, hunched over a freshly mutilated cow. He argued his innocence, but any protestation was cut short by a contemptuous blow. He was, they decreed, possessed, and by lash or by rack, the demon would be driven out. Chapter 4. Mark of the Beast. The hooded acolytes were accompanied by a torturer. The order had sent its most rabid dogs to exorcise the demon. One last howl. One final scream. Fear, indignation, confusion, and rage. His terror triggered a cathartic transformation. Chapter 5. Inhuman Bondage. He regained his faculties, huddled in the brooding darkness of the catacombs, far beneath the tower. The echoes of horrified screams and the clang of alarm bells pricked his ears. He wept bitterly over sins he did not remember, and slipped himself back into his chains. He was an abomination, and could no longer trust his own body. Metal and man, soldier and sword, forged in the fires of war. Crusader. Chapter 1. Leper the Land. Autumn's inexorable march was underway, and the race was on to save the harvest from the first frost. Despite his exertions, their yield was paltry. Come winter, starvation would seat itself at the head of their table. Chapter 2. Hard Pressed. The banners of the Holy Army snapped in the biting wind that scoured his barren plot. Taking the quill from the attending officer, he signed his name crudely upon the weathered scroll. He had no love of violence, but his absence would stay famine's hand. He accepted both tabard and blade, bid his wife and son a stoic farewell, and rode out reluctantly to make war. Chapter 3. The Great Crusade. The cacophony of conflict rang bloody in his ears. Trumpets and drums shouted orders, the screams of the dead and the dying. But in the maelstrom of mortal combat, he found a divine peace. He came to relish the cleaving blade and zealous bloodlust, losing himself entirely to the terrible delights of battle. Chapter 4. blood in the snow. The enemy camp rang with the clamor of terrified recognition. They knew his frightful reputation. At the moment of execution, he demurred. This one could live on in humiliation, a mockery of the mercy his enemies knew he did not possess. Chapter 5. No home but hell. Motionless upon his warhorse, he contemplated the scene of stifling domesticity in the familiar valley below. The boy played idly in the muddy field while the mother hung sheets upon a tattered line. From his saddle, he planted his heraldic banner in the thawing soil, tossing the whole of his earnings in its shadow. He blew hard into his war horn and turned to rejoin his regiment. He did not look back. Perfection glints wicked along the rapier's edge. Duelist. Chapter 1. Academy Duello. She would wake before dawn, stretch, meditate, and portion her food with exacting care. The Academy expected discipline, but she sought to exceed it, shunning the earnest social overtures of her peers in favor of training exhaustively, long into the twilight. She did not grieve this isolation. Perfection demanded sacrifice. Chapter 2. After Hours. Beneath her doublet, a swelling desire to go beyond her instructor's expectations, to earn his respect, and perhaps his attention. Nimble and sure-footed, her flawless form drew his notice. Chapter 3. Insatiable. Under more direct tutelage, she blossomed, a formidable fighter, fastidious in the extreme, and possessed of a ruthless single-mindedness. It was this absence of fear that gave her an uncanny edge. Between instructor and pupil, the intimacy of martial respect boiled over into a simmering entanglement, and soon, long hours of drills regularly culminated in amorous clashes, as fierce as any rencontre. Chapter 4. A Taste of Victory. In the afterglow of their exertions, playful teasing gave rise to a contest of skill. She had done as he trained her to do, flawlessly and without hesitation. Chapter 5. The Perfection. As she slid her blade free of her fallen lover, the purity of her pursuit shivered through her veins. Sport was an unacceptable abstraction. The true test of skill lay in contest to the death. She whispered tender thanks to him for this final posthumous lesson, then threw his cape over her shoulder. Hers would be a life steeped in violent hazard until she found an opponent worthy of spilling her blood. Zealotry, an undying blight upon the soul. Flagellant. Chapter 1. Baptism. He was a listless shade of the city, indifferent to his penury. With his skeletal build and bleeding gums, he looked an easy target for a pair of drunks seeking an outlet for their frustrations. The blows rained down, a tooth cracked, and a feverish crimson eclipsed his vision. In pain, there was power. He rose above his panting assailants and, reveling in the marks of their sin, forgave them their trespasses. Chapter 2. In Service of the Divine. Drawn to the somber depths of the Church's oubliettes, he pledged his life to the clergy. There he inflicted death by slow, delicious degrees, each crack of the lash an honor, a gift, a morbid sacrament. But his zeal proved too ardent, his brethren too timid. They cast him out, rendered him once more onto the streets. Chapter 3. More. He roved out in search of torment, consuming the sin of any who would purge their misdeeds upon his body. Each wound fueled his fervor, a rapture only found in baptism by the lash. Drunk on his bloody intinctions, manic with the need for some elusive apotheosis, he gouged at himself without mercy. As blood poured from his rended flesh, his consciousness faltered, and the thundering hoofbeats of death rang violent in his ears. Chapter 4. Death's Door. Her scythe promised numbing obliviation, a premature end to his sacred journey of sensation. absent from the world's gruesome delights. His power was enough to defy death herself. Chapter 5. Behold the man. Once more he wandered, ravenous for fresh suppering, and delighting in its novelty and excess. Offering himself to blade and talon alike, he became an icon writ in flesh, a living prayer to whatever gods would turn an ear. Undying, he savored his delicious declension, an eternity of pain and wrath, heaven on earth. A sister of battle, repudiated but unbowed. Vestal. Chapter 1. Want not. Together with her sisters, she tended the Order's sacred flame in pious humility. The Abbey's austere arches and sanctified masonry afforded her a life of sheltered privilege that few beyond the walls could imagine. Discipline was paramount, and when forbidden desires would seek to distract her from monastic toil, she smothered them. Reluctantly. Chapter 2. A momentary lapse. She was a paragon of duty and virtue, but reminders of her deprivation were everywhere. Surely she deserved some indulgence for her labors. Immersed in her reverie, she started violently at the piercing admonitions of the furious abbot. Chapter 3. No God but men. Her terrified wails rang off the transepts as the abbot dragged her to the oubliette. As a deterrent to the congregation, her punishment would be more than commensurate with her blasphemy. Locked interminably in the festering dark, she awaited retribution from the divine, while suffering the mortal tortures of its enraged servants. Chapter 4. Divine Intervention. Vindication. A golden ray beamed affirmation into the stagnant blackness of the dungeon. No divine punishment awaited her. It was her captors who had strayed from the light. Radiant with revelation, she stormed the stairs to the cloisters. Chapter 5. Wrath. Eager to share her emancipation with her convent, she rushed headlong toward the dormitory. But where the chamber door once stood, she was met instead by a sheer wall of fresh masonry. Her cries of jubilation died in her throat. From behind the drying mortar and sturdy stone, there came a feeble scratching. Then her sister's last hideous gasps. The price of her wantonness would not be measured solely in blows from the flail. Nothing remains, save a burning will to survive. Runaway. Chapter 1. The Pigs of St. Martha's. Her pious caretakers had marked her for the last time. Tonight, she would escape their cruelty at last. Ran blindly into the rain, the squeals of the pursuing sisters lost in the howling wind. Chapter 2. Beloved. Good fortune is a rare and wondrous thing. She straggled from place to place, drenched and hungry, until a kindly woodsman and his wife happened upon her. Childless themselves, they welcomed her into their home, where she warmed herself in the glow of their hearth and hearts. Chapter 3. Drawn to the Flame. She would stay up long into the night, tending the fire. Captivated by its shifting hues, she thrilled to the eerie dance of spark and ember, running her fingers absent-mindedly over the scars that patterned her arm. The hearthlight seemed somehow alive, and in these private moments, she yearned to reach out and be touched once again by its searing embrace. Chapter 4. Burnt Offering. An accident, but surely there was time to contain the flames. The walls were alight. There was no stopping it now. Chapter 5. Ashes. She stood in the center of the inferno, transfixed by its swirling kaleidoscopic beauty. Her rapturous fixation was cut short by a heavy beam falling from the ceiling, blocking the door. Panicked, she dove headlong through a window as the cabin bloomed into a pyre. Heaped upon the wet grass, she heard the screams of her adoptive parents, trapped and burning in their bedroom. To know the abyss, one must embrace it. Occultist. Chapter 1. The Ritual. On certain portentous evenings carefully selected for their astrological potency, he would gather his devotees around the ancient onyx table, and joining hands with them, would send his spirit out into the void. Safely tethered by their vital energies, he was free to wander the outer spheres in search of some dark communion and impossible power. 2. A door in the desert. He found himself in a vast expanse of windswept dunes. Ahead, the stone spires of a pyramidal temple called down jagged bolts from a rolling, angry sky. Undaunted, he crossed the threshold of the towering aperture, settled himself upon the central dais, and prepared for the coming sacrifice. Chapter 3. Some parts must die. Terrible though it was, he would pay the price for power. Emptiness in him called out across boundless gulfs of unknown space. For nature abhors a vacuum. Chapter 4. The Guest. Drawing vitality from the assembled mediums, he would hold fast against the thing and harness a portion of its power. Steady yourself. Imbued with strange currents of infernal origin, his apotheosis was complete. Chapter 5. An Eternal Flame. Emerging from his trance, he met the charred, steaming corpses of his acolytes with a shudder. He could sense the eldritch entity stalking the edges of his consciousness, probing for weaknesses. He had become a beacon, a conduit to unknown regions, and would be assailed by those blasphemous forces all the rest of his days. Making peace with adversity is the very essence of existence. Leper. Chapter 1. Shun them not. Despite the protestations of his royal advisors, he would visit with the sick and dying, providing them what comfort he could. and infirm were far less repulsive to him than the venomous whispers of his scoffing entourage. Chapter 2. Infection. Early signs could be ignored or concealed, but soon the reality was inescapable, whether by some affliction of lineage or by direct transmission. Symptoms of incurable disease began to openly manifest themselves. Racked with pain, he summoned doctors and aides from the farthest reaches of his lands, all of whom concluded the worst. The king was dying. Chapter 3. Treason. Sedition, like any illness, spreads slowly. Rotten with a cynical opportunism born of long-standing entitlement, the scheming circle of advisors drafted mutinous plans. Though bedridden, he had long since divined their intent, and feared the disastrous results of their would-be rule. Summoning his blacksmith and his strength, he hoisted his blade and rose to meet the coming threat. Chapter 4. The Purge. He had shown his compassion. Now, he would show his fury. The slow suffering begins. Slow suffering begins. blade had broken, but so too the treasonous plot. Chapter 5. A beautiful view. Satisfied that the spirit of his benevolent tenure would endure, he abdicated the throne. People gathered at windows and along the roads, weeping. Some threw petals at his feet, while others watched in reverent stoicism. As he walked beyond the city gates, he marveled at the beauty of the world and was grateful for his many blessings. A murderous melody lingers, long after the final chord has been struck. Jester. Chapter 1. Some strange melody. He was a layabout without aspiration or purpose, content to loiter on street corners, languidly busking for passers-by. Roughly ushered from the bustling commercial blocks, he wandered the forgotten corners of the city. An intoxicating melody drifted over a nearby cemetery wall, and he stumbled deliriously amongst the tombstones in search of the performer. Chapter 2. Music of the Night. He could learn this unearthly hymn and claim it as his own. Ambition, so long dormant within him, had been roused. He delighted in fantasies of fame, renown, and respect. Chapter 3. Play to the crowd. When word of his uncommon talent reached the palace, he was summoned to entertain king and court. Anticipating an historic performance and enthused adulation, he was stunned to find himself instead the object of their debased ridicule. While his noble audience dined drunkenly, he was mocked, tortured, and subjected to an obscene array of dangerous and decadent humiliations. a dark song. He unleashed his resentment upon instrument and crowd, playing the demoniac melody with unrestrained fury. This was the song of the dead, and it had exacted a fitting tribute. Chapter 5. Finale. Bowing low, he basked in the echoing applause of dripping blood. The scene of wholesale dismemberment drove him to fits of mirthless hysterics. He was laughing still as he placed the blade against his own hand, severing his connection to whatever twisted talent he had so fleetingly enjoyed. Aimlessly, he drifted from the hall, humming broken bars of a discordant melody he could not quite remember. Beneath bloodlust and fury, there is emptiness and shame. Hellion. Chapter 1. The Eve of Glory. She was young to join the war band, but any who challenged her readiness were met with clenched fists and violent indignation. Having bloodied the last of her detractors, the matter was considered finally settled. On the eve of battle, she joined her clanmates in a raucous celebration, her stein and her spirits overflowing with abundance. Chapter 2. The Brave. She was the tip of the spear, poised to sunder the enemy line, to live forever in the songs of her people. work. Lethality writ large. Her entire life spent in preparation. But when it mattered most, she had failed. Chapter 3. Night in the Woods. As the advancing army moved on, she huddled tightly in the tree's clammy roots, hoping to be somehow swallowed up into the earth. At dawn, she woke tormented by the exuberant cries of carrion crows, come to feast upon the corpses of her kin. When at last she stirred, the scavengers took flight, repulsed by the sight of this undeserving revenant. Chapter 4. Shame and Exile. She had shunned a warrior's death, and her cowardice would be impugned. Anxiety foments insidious fears. Anxiety foments insidious fears. They cast her out, an exile, unwelcome and unsung. Chapter 5. The Great Emptiness. Alone and untethered, she wandered the countryside, fighting for sport and soaking her wounds in wine. She sought death at every turn, desperate for a second chance to prove her mettle. But it seemed even that terrible wraith had forsaken her. Her isolation was absolute. Her shame barely concealed by a fragile facade of fearlessness. Pride, more devastating than the horrors of 100 campaigns. Man-at-Arms. Chapter 1. A premature promotion. The politics of a military career are perhaps as treacherous as war itself. Though untested in combat, his acumen for advancement was unmatched. Through a dubious campaign of influence and intimidation, he had at last claimed a coveted command, and was eager to bask in the glory of the victories that were sure to come. Chapter 2. A Leader of Men. Behold the conquering general, marching his men to victory. rout. A massacre. A complete and total failure of command. Chapter 3. One Eye Open. Every night, the men of his regiment would interrupt his fitful convalescence. Mutilated and maimed, the spectral garrison clawed at his bed covers, whispering hateful truths in his ears. The exhausted attendants in the field hospital would wake to the sound of panicked screaming and inglorious sobs. It was not the war that had taken his eye. It was pride. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. Demoted and disgraced, he returned to the battlefield, ready to endure the wrath of his regiment and grant them some small peace. At last, he would sleep undisturbed, and perhaps find some comfort in that murky abyss of dreamless wonder. Chapter 5. In the Trenches. He resolved to spend his remaining years seeking atonement in the trenches of bloody battlefields the world over. For him, there could be no respite from the horrors of war, and when at last he was struck down, he would die alone and unremembered. Surely, He deserved no better. Hunted, harried, a fugitive seeking to outpace the past. Highwayman. Chapter 1. Freedom. A prison riot. A fleeting chance to escape incarceration. Be a fugitive, a hunted man, but a free one nonetheless. Chapter 2. Laying Low. Harried by a pursuing garrison, he took refuge in the fetid canals of the city. Concealment took its toll, and soon he began to see himself in the furtive, scurrying pests that formed an unfortunate portion of his meager diet. Freedom, once so fondly imagined, had become a vortex of degradation. Chapter 3. One last job. He was sick and starving, and in desperation, offered his expertise to an unscrupulous malefactor. Shackled once more to an unsavory task by an advance of gold, he lined his belly, girded himself, and prepared for one final heist. Chapter 4. Highway Robbery. The stagecoach arrived, and he set himself to the business of bloodshed and robbery. fulfilled his obligations with exceptional lethality. But his grim satisfaction would prove short-lived. Chapter 5. Shackled. The lifeless bodies of a woman and child, horribly mutilated by errant gunfire, stared spectrally through the remnants of the coach door. Arrested by the ghoulish sight, he felt the cold chains of remorse tighten around his heart. Guilt was a pursuer he could never outrun, a prison he would never escape. Avarice slips unseen into the catacombs of the mind. Grave Robber. Chapter 1. Luxury's Lap. Born into money and married into more, she spent her days on horseback and her evenings in the ballroom. She was the object of her husband's boorish lust and drunken temper, placating his worst tendencies with a veneer of gracious deference, all the while indulging murderous fantasies of freedom and the fortune that would soon be hers. Chapter 2. Nightcap. Night after night of disrespect and abuse, enough was enough. She listened, smirking, as his empty apologies came in desperate, choking gags. Chapter 3. Embarrassment of Riches. Years of decadence and financial mismanagement had left the estate in staggering debt. Humiliated and facing eviction, she wandered the empty halls, hurling inebriated indignities at the portrait of the deceased, whose hand had rested so possessively upon her shoulder. A gleam of gold on that painted paw reminded her that his rings were unaccounted for, and must have been buried with him. Chapter 4. Filthy Rich. To preserve her social standing, she would pilfer the rings from his fingers, the gold from his teeth. Was awash in exhilaration, the glint in her eyes outshining the fistful of ill-gotten gains. Chapter 5. The After Party. Armed officials dispatched to oversee the eviction were shocked to find the front doors listlessly ajar. The lavish carpets were lousy with dirt and leaves. A heap of heirlooms gleamed on the ballroom floor, rings and brooches in a careless pile. The lady of the manor, however, was nowhere to be found. Indiscriminate science stains the surgeon's hands. Plague Doctor. Chapter 1. The Good Student. Brilliant and bold, her unconventional theories created nothing short of a scandal in her 4th year. The mocking whispers and scornful glares of her peers and professors had an ironically invigorating effect on her extracurricular experiments. The mysteries of the human body, of life and death itself, hovered just above her scalpel's reach. if only she could acquire a corpse of sufficient freshness. Chapter 2. Head of the class. Her professor was a relic, hacking and wheezing his way through a hopelessly conventional curriculum. She delighted in the combative debate, and behind her bookish glasses, reveled in their outrage and confusion. Chapter 3. Extra credit. By the second semester, her research was at a critical point, and regular supply raids of the university laboratories had become necessary. During one such expedition, she stumbled upon her professor, awkwardly slumped over his podium, a bloody kerchief on the floor. Here, then, was her ideal cadaver, her long-awaited opportunity, and she would not waste it. Chapter 4. Failing grade. Success. Vindication. The human machine restored to action. The shrieking and wailing was horrible. But the silence that followed was even worse. Chapter 5. Do no harm. Disposal of the body was a procedural affair. A carboy of acid would dissolve the thing and no evidence would remain. In the weeks that followed, however, she found herself unable to focus, sitting motionless at her desk, paralyzed by the ceaseless wailing that reverberated in her mind. He has no past, no future, no mercy.